Hello, everybody, and welcome to the UnWokable podcast. I am your host, Mark Owsley, and I am waiting on Angel. He's running just a few minutes behind. Our guest for today, Angel Eduardo, who wrote the piece for FAIR yesterday, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation. Let me just get this out of the way while we're waiting for him. If you like what I'm doing on the channel, if you like any of the information I'm giving you, if you think it's useful, please like, subscribe, share this video, hit the bell to help support what I'm doing here, and that would be very helpful to me. I'd like to thank Fair for tweeting out the uh, the notice for this. That was very kind. Um, and again, I'm hoping that Angel will get here and sat down here in just a few minutes. He just ran a few minutes late. Also, did a cast earlier you can check out about DEI and the FBI. And so you can go like that video, share that video. And this is a bit awkward on dead air, but I will say this. I enjoyed Angel's piece. We have just a few disagreements that I think we can iron out. I think it boils down to a functionality issue. Other than that, we are both on the same side. I think we both would agree with that we want to see the influence of a destructive ideology be rooted out, or at least be abated for another. So I think that this should be a great conversation and on that regard, but I think it's important that we fine tune what it is that we're doing. And I'm not an ideologue. I can be convinced and have just some questions, but let him talk about his piece and make sure that it is characterized in the right way. And it should be a fun cast. If you are listening to this in Oklahoma, let me just say this, and it's still October 23rd, or excuse me, August 23rd. Go out and vote for Ryan Walters for State Superintendent, Public Instruction. He is the best candidate, and he knows the exact issues that Angel and I will be discussing today in terms of how to deal with this pervasive ideology that has kind of infected society, and which is the whole reason that FAIR began back when they started, and I was a chapter leader there, and worked well, and have since moved on and done some different things. Just my understanding, and I'll confirm this with Angel when he gets on, is that FAIR, he is the FAIR message person. Basically, he's the director of messaging for FAIR, and which would make sense. And it communicates very well. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And I am stalling just a little bit. So if there's anybody watching that wants to comment and say hello, you can do that as we wait for Angel to come into the room. Some other things that we might be able to talk about that I've got coming ahead. I'm going to be going through a public school DEI training here shortly. I'm going to be writing a little bit about DEI and the IRS and how that relates to hiring practices. Oh, and here he comes. Hold on just one moment. And Angel, how are you?
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Hey, I started a little bit without you just because we run a little past time. I did my little spiel about like and subscribe and all of that. So but everybody, welcome Angel Eduardo. I'm so happy to have you here, brother. I appreciate you being here. I appreciated your piece, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to come in and speak for yourself on it. Since I did a little cast, I always want to offer that opportunity. Correct me if I'm wrong, you are the director of messaging for FAIR, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And what is there any other work that you do for FAIR?
Well, I edit the Substack, and I'm also an advisor. I'm also on the advisory board and a fellow for FAIR in the Arts, which is kind
Awesome.
of the arts and entertainment arm of FAIR. We're kind of doing the same sort of FAIR stuff, but focused in the arts.
That's great. Well, I have a doctorate in music, so I'm right there
Oh.
with you. I love the arts, and I've looked a bit into fair at the arts. I used to be a chapter leader and worked with fair before, um, and good organization. And I just wanted to bring you on. I'm going to let you talk about your piece so you can characterize it the exact way that you intended it. And then I just want to ask some questions and have a
Mhm.
bit of a discussion. So, first of all, just give us the title of your piece and lay it out for us. You all can find that on the Fair Substack, by the way. Go there, read it. I'll actually post it here in the comment section so you can read it. So go ahead, Angel.
Uh, well, actually, I mean, I think the piece kind of speaks for itself. I try really hard to
Well, I mean, for my
make it as
listeners who may
clear
not
as
have
I
read it.
can.
Yeah, no,
Right,
I think
right.
you did it. For my listeners who may not have read it, can you give us just a summation of what the piece says?
Right, right, yeah, and I was
Yeah.
about to say, the video you put out yesterday did a pretty good job as well. You went through it, but basically the idea is that, DEI in its true sense, I would say, can be a good thing and can do good. It's just that it often doesn't because its fundamental premises are flawed or misguided.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that there isn't something that is to be, that there's a baby in the bathwater there,
Okay.
and that it's a good thing. And the reason why people gravitate towards it, the reason why, even people who are not ideologically captured by that particular side of things resonate with it, and it sounds like a good idea, and it seems like something that's good and that will fix certain issues that exist, is because there are fundamental things that are good within it. There are fundamental things at their core that are good. It's just being misused and misapplied. And I think that's obviously a problem. And I think I use the piece to kind of point out specific sort of, they're anecdotal, but I think they're
Hmm.
emblematic, specific points that I've personally experienced in the ways that a lot of the, more problematic approaches to this sort of stuff lead people to have tunnel vision,
Hmm.
lead people to, the line I say in the piece is like, it's more than just someone with a hammer always finding nails. It's like
Yeah.
someone with a hammer owning a nail factory. And I think that is the biggest part of it, is that,
Hmm.
you know, there's something self-perpetuating in the way that the framework is currently employed. But I happen to know that there is a better way to address real issues that occur, mix-ups like the ones that I illustrated in my piece, where
Uh-huh.
uh, someone who is racialized as white mistakes one person of color, quote unquote, for another.
Hmm.
That stuff happens, and there are a
Yeah.
million different reasons why that stuff might happen.
Hmm.
Racism is only one possible reason why that might happen.
That's
Now,
absolutely right.
and it's okay to find out and point out that it's racism if it is,
If it
but
is,
it's
yes.
wrong if it is, of course. But
Yeah.
it's just, if that's where your arrow is constantly pointing, and if
Hmm.
that's where your brain is constantly being trained to go,
Hmm.
then it's the hammer looking for nails, and the hammer ending up owning a nail factory and producing nails just to
Right.
hit them. So
Right.
that's generally the idea. But the crux of it is that there is a baby in the bathwater. There is something that can be done to ease workplace conflicts, to resolve them, to emphasize common humanity, to never forget every single person's unique individuality, to not make people into avatars for identity
Hmm.
groups. There's a way to do this stuff that is constructive and productive
Okay.
rather than divisive. So generally, that's
Well,
what I'm getting.
and that is a noble goal. And like I said when I was talking about your piece yesterday, I found it very interesting because I think
Hmm.
it there's a bit of a divide in kind of maybe the camp that I'm in, so to speak, or at least my own study, because I've been studying it for a long time. It's mostly
Hmm.
been individual, but let's start here. Let's start at the base. How
Okay.
would you define DEI? Because I think we want to make sure that we're not cross talking, right?
Hmm.
So what is you said in your previous statement that um, DEI in its true form or DEI the way it's being practiced. So there's a division here, right?
Yes.
How would you? Can you give me your definition of DEI as you were talking about it in the piece?
Yeah. I don't know if I actually outlined it exactly, but my contention is that there are misapplications of the terms, and you know, diversity in its true sense is a great thing. You want people from different perspectives, different backgrounds, with different experience, different points of view. You want that. That strengthens any cohort, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want monomania, and you don't want tunnel vision.
Right.
So that's great.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, of course, is that in its current form, the vast majority of people who use the word diversity are using it in the way that Barbara Fields of Racecraft, she's a historian at Columbia University. She wrote the book Racecraft. She says, it's basically just getting together a bunch of people who look different but think the same.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right. That's the problem. Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's diversity. Equity is defined as the quality of being fair and impartial. That's great. That makes perfect sense. But equity, as it's being currently employed, is being made to mean, people reach the finish line at the exact same time with the exact same score,
Mm-hmm.
and that's absurd, right?
Mm-hmm.
It
Yeah.
completely minimizes all the complexity of human beings and the circumstances they're in, right? And inclusion, I mean, I just think the people in question, the people who I think we both agree are causing issues,
Mm-hmm.
are just doing the exact opposite of that, right? They're excluding anybody that doesn't adhere to certain rigid norms,
Mm-hmm.
thought patterns, opinions, etc. Whereas true inclusion should be, hey, I disagree with you, but you have a seat at the table, and that's a valuable thing.
Yeah.
And that's what we want. We want everyone to feel that they are a part of this thing that we're trying to do. In this case, it would be, this project we call America.
Right.
Everyone should feel that they have a stake in it. Everyone should feel that they are part of it, that it matters. And everyone, then that ties in with the diversity part, where you're coming from a different place. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Let's figure out together what works best so that we
Okay.
can both or all move forward together, right?
And that's the ideal purpose, or what you would say is maybe even your. I don't want to mischaracterize you, but maybe even your idealistic definition of what those things should mean in practice, right?
Well,
Or
I
what,
think,
or what they, because my contention here, and
yeah.
I'm going to be as concise as I can, is that there's a major difference between the way the words are thrown at us, right? There's a
Mhm.
rhetorical shield, right? And then there's a practical nature of them as defined, not independently, but as a unit, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
um, they, going back, and I'm just going to give a synopsis of my point, because I agree with everything that you are saying, because you're wrapping them around the words in the truest, altruistic definition of those words that we all would like them to mean, or that we all thought they should mean when first presented to us, right?
Mhm.
So my concern is that DEI as a unit, as a structure, okay, was first really seen and put into a structure by Barack Obama in 2011. Okay,
Mhm.
Barack Obama uh, did and he wrote up and signed an executive order um, embedding he called it D&I, or diversity and inclusion, into all of the systems of the federal government, right? And that was specifically pointed at hiring, right? Under the guise of affirmative action, right?
Mhm.
And I think that there's a healthy affirmative action debate and there are merit on both sides, but the way that that structure has been weaponized makes it difficult for me to see how we can divorce the terms from the structure. Because they've become now, since 2011, so ubiquitous in society as a certain structure.
Mhm.
Um, and my concern is that by accepting the words, or trying to even reappropriate the words in that way, we're
Mhm.
accepting their premise, and their premise is kind of, it's a mirage, right? They use diversity as a shield, inclusion is the mechanism to get people in or out of the institution, and equity is the goal, and they don't define equity the way that you defined it,
Right.
at least in practice. Would you
Hmm.
agree with that summation of what I'm saying, or at least
Um,
understand what I'm saying?
well, I guess here's the thing that I think. Uh, Here's I think where the main point of disagreement is. I think that actually, let's see if I'm wrong here.
Okay.
Based on your response yesterday, my perception of your perspective is that um, everything I said is all well and good. The problem is these terms have been hijacked and they are now being misused or now just used in this different way, and that if I or anybody else fails to acknowledge that, and if I continue to use those terms, what I'm basically doing is stepping foot in their court and playing ball with them, and ultimately losing because they own the game. Is that
Um,
generally where you're at?
I would say that the latter half is probably correct. I would say this, and I don't think that they were hijacked. I think as a unit they were created because
Okay.
diversity, equity, and inclusion as a unit. And so, and in
Right.
your piece, you're talking about DEI, right? So it becomes a
Hmm.
structure.
The
The word,
programs, yeah.
right, right. Well, yes, the programs.
Hmm.
Inclusion is its own word. Equity is its own word that actually has 4 or 5 different definitions depending on
Right.
which context you're using. Diversity, obviously, but as a unit, they actually created that, and that is a definition in and of itself, if that
Okay.
makes sense.
So those three terms put together as a program is a new thing, and if I or anyone else kind of mistakenly adheres to that new thing based on the definitions of each individual term, I have already seeded something or
Yes.
everything.
Well, no, I wouldn't say everything. Okay, so I don't want to be hyperbolic. My
Hmm.
concern is that we're if there's a book called Counter Wokecraft, James Lindsay's new discourse that talks about the danger of the words as being traps because
Hmm.
they're all used in a sheen of classical liberalism, which I think is
Hmm.
great, right? And the ideas that come out of class, the Enlightenment, just like I talked with Jason Littlefield about, right? Those are all great, but my fear is that those who lean center left or who would consider themselves progressives in the before times, you know, um, have failed to realize that it's that the some of those aspects of classical liberalism were actually what allowed this to embed itself into our
Hmm.
institutions, and the words themselves, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are in them themselves prime examples of that.
Hmm.
And so I'm concerned that if we try to, because I know FAIR has a lot of programs going, and I was around when some of them were coming up, Fair in the Arts, Fair in Medicine, and all of these are virtuous programs. I mean, I think I
Hmm.
see the goals behind them. But my concern has always been that if you use their language, you're ceding a bit of ground, but also over time, because of where we're at in our educational system right now, that eventually they're just going to be reappropriated because they created that term in general,
Hmm.
right? And
Gotcha. Okay.
this is a war of language, you know.
Yeah, so I think it's more than a war of language. I actually wouldn't even use the language of war. I think that that's already a problem. I think the problem with so much of the way that we're going about this stuff and disagreeing with one another about these things
Mhm.
is that this mentality, this kind of uh, using the metaphor of war and putting ourselves in that frame of mind is already disastrous to us personally, corrosive to us, our own self, because we are pitting ourselves in opposition to one another in such a way where conversation is off the table. So that's just an aside, I guess,
Okay.
but I always flag that because it's
Okay.
so easy for us to fall into, we're in the trenches and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's bad for our brains.
Okay.
I think I
And
think that framework is bad for our brain. But
I would agree with that. I just want to, on your little
Mhm,
aside, I would agree with that. But I think your statement there kind of reinforces my point about the functional aspect of DEI.
mhm.
Because just in the same way, and there's a valid point there, and I'm ceding that valid point when it comes to the
Yeah,
war terms, right? It's the same. I get upset when people start talking about national divorce or anything like that, right?
right.
And that's just an extension of the war metaphor, right? If you want
Mhm.
to talk about civil war or whatever that may be,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I come from, if you, uh, I've heard as a married person, right?
Mhm.
You mentioned divorce in your marriage, it's more likely going to happen, right? So I will cede that ground. Yeah,
Right.
I will cede that ground on the war, but I think that reinforces my point to an
Right. That if we
extent.
use the framework of DEI, then we have already put ourselves into a losing sort of state of mind,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
Okay, so I see that. I know what you mean, and I had a feeling that that was my understanding based on what you said yesterday in your video.
Hmm.
My contention with that is that the actual concession there, the actual loss, is giving them the terms in the first place. The actual concession is to say those are their terms, these are their words, this is their language. No, it isn't. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Diversity does not belong to them. They don't get to just take it and twist it and pervert it and misuse it and then cause us to abandon it. No way.
Okay.
What I'm going to do is say, no, 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 no. You guys are doing it wrong. You guys are saying it wrong. This is the wrong way to do this. And I'm never
Okay.
going to give up the principle which they are perverting. Right.
Okay.
And a good example, here's another one. I get this all the time. People call me an idealist all the time. And when they say that, what they mean is that I'm naive, that I'm pie in the sky, that I think everything's great, and that I'm not aware of all the problems in the world, right? And
Hmm.
that's not what idealism actually is. Idealism is ambition. Idealism is refusing to cede the future to the present or the present to the past.
Hmm.
That's idealism. And so when people say you're an idealist, I know what they mean, but I'm telling them you're wrong about this. And I'm not going to give that term up just because you're misusing it.
Well,
It's a
that's just
similar
one
thing.
of the words.
Right.
And see, here's the I would take issue with your definition of equity, because if you look at equity, even in um, it's been redefined even online now. I mean, even in the dictionary at different points, right? Just like racism
Yeah,
has.
sure.
And yeah, yeah, um, but equity in and of itself, at its base content, right, is usually been used to define things in terms of material possessions. Right. And so I
Mhm.
think they're being straightforward with the word equity. I don't, it is different than equality. I think Fair would say that. If not, I think that's a discussion that we should all have at a
Mhm.
different point. But there's a difference between equity and equality, or equal opportunity, right? And
Yes.
and inclusion. Here's the other part about it is inclusion. We all must remember that. Okay, let me ask you this: would you believe that, or do you ascribe that DEI's practice now is rooted in critical theory, critical race theory, praxis, as it's practiced by many of our institutions who would do the training that you were talking about
Yeah,
in your
most of
article.
them
Most of them,
most of them I would say are informed by that sort of stuff. Not
yeah.
necessarily. I mean, it's there's a quagmire there with just invoking critical theory or critical race theory because it's become this catch-all term that it's you waste more time trying to make sure that you understand what the other person means by it
Well,
than
but
you
I
would
would
if you
say
use
that with
something else. But
DEI as well. But
right.
that's exactly my point. But so
Well, I think that with something as obscure as critical theory or relatively obscure as critical theory, it's a little bit different than if you are, some nonprofit organization and you have this consultant that you're trying to bring in to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. Right. Now we're at the street level. We're kind of colloquially speaking. Most people's understanding of those terms are the good ones. They're the right ones. And I think that very thing is being hijacked. That very thing
right.
is being weaponized. But that doesn't mean we should give up the thing. That means we should that means we should defend against the weaponization. That means we should defend against the misuse, right? Because diversity, equity, inclusion are good things, and it's good for people to want them,
I would
right?
I would I would not say that equity is a good thing for people to want in the context of social structures. I would
Well, again,
disagree with that.
it's yeah,
Out of
but right, but
eh,
again, you have to keep in mind what most people, when they hear that word, are not thinking in these kind of culture war high minded ways. They're just thinking, oh yeah,
right, but
treating people impartially,
it's
right?
exactly that difference between the practice and
Right.
the use of the word that is the problem.
Yes,
So
and I
so
fully agree there.
right,
And
right.
so all I'm saying is we change the practice. We don't have to give up the
Okay.
use or understanding of the word.
Well,
That's what the essay is.
okay. Well, then let me meet you at where you're. Let me change gears and let me meet you at where you're saying that your essay is, because that's why I asked you to be here, and I want to be fair.
Mhm.
Um, um, are
You
you
were great, by
concerned?
the way.
Oh no,
By
it's
the
fine.
way, you were great
I
with your video yesterday, and
okay,
you totally got it.
okay.
You were totally on point. So you did a great job.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I want to be as
and I
intellectually.
appreciate it.
No,
Yeah,
yeah. Well, and I thought it was a good piece. Otherwise, I wouldn't have. It made me think, and that's that. And
sure.
that's obviously what we all want to do, right? Is we want to make each other think about these things, and so
Right,
we can come out with the best, you know, possible ending, or not ending, but continuation of our society, right? That's why we do this,
right,
right? And that's why
exactly.
FAIR was started, and all of that. But I will say this: are you concerned that there is, you mentioned throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. I want to take that idea and apply it to what I think is the root here, is that there should be a
Hmm.
central management of interpersonal relationships between adults. That I go back
Mm,
to, go back to the coddling of the American mind, right? And if you've read that, Jonathan Hyde, I mean,
sure.
great book, and he talks about where children nowadays are kind of being trained to, over the course of time, because they're not allowed to have free play, they're not allowed to um, uh, fix problems in amongst each other by themselves, that they always kind of run and tell the adult, right? Are you concerned that DEI, as even as a good apparatus, right, if we could put it in its best possible term, the way that you
Hmm.
could envision it, right, is seeding the ground that adults need that kind of institutional central structure to do what should come naturally, or do what adults should be responsible to do, which is, you know, deal with conflict interpersonally as adults?
Hmm. Well, there are two things there, right? The first thing is the obvious thing, which is that most companies and organizations that are instituting this stuff don't necessarily care about, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion as those terms should be understood, right? They
Mhm,
don't necessarily care. I'm sure most of them do personally, but as an organization, that's not really what their motivation is. Their motivation is to avoid liability, you know, that sort of stuff. And, on the plus side, maybe increase productivity
mhm,
and increase the pool of applicants and get a better cohort of applicants, right? Figure out where
mhm,
their blind spots are and fix those things so that they can
mhm,
get the best people, right? So that's a, positively skewed way of looking at it.
mhm,
So there's that, and that's the reason why you have consultants, and that's the reason why there are businesses that are, you know, created for this specific purpose, right? But
mhm,
interpersonally, down to the interpersonal level, workplace conflicts happen
mhm,
constantly because
mhm.
people are different.
People.
They work
Mhm,
differently. They understand each other differently. They misunderstand each other constantly, right?
mhm,
People don't know how to talk to each other. Um, these things happen constantly. That can be disruptive to a work environment, right? So, just on that level alone, it makes sense for an organization to say, hey, why don't we bring in some people whose expertise is on conflict resolution in this kind of way? And they can kind of give us some pointers on how to do it better. It's like couples therapy, right? Couples therapy exists for a reason. It's because a lot of couples need help talking to each other.
mhm,
Therapy exists for a reason because a lot of people need help working out all their hangups and flaws and foibles and coming to terms with their experiences and their upbringings and all this stuff, right? Therapy is huge. and it's great. And, friendships fall apart, friendships are strained because people have trouble communicating with one another.
Mm-hmm.
All the things that I'm pointing out here are highlighting what I think is a need that can be filled by something like a program like this, depending on the circumstances, right?
Yeah.
If you know so there's that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I hear your point about the coddling of the American mind and all that sort of stuff, and we don't want micromanagement, but there's no reason why something like this needs to be micromanagement. What it can be is something like coaching or a personal trainer, right? Like, I don't need somebody to tell me how to run. I
Mm-hmm.
don't need somebody to tell me how to do push-ups,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe I'm really out of shape, or maybe I'm not
Yes, but
motivated,
but uh, but I,
you
I
know?
don't think that's a direct correlation you can make. It's not an apples to apples. I see what you're saying in terms of the personal trainer, right? I mean, there's
Mhm.
especially in American society today, we're all a little bit out of shape more than we should be, right? But here's the thing. I
Right.
think that there's a stark difference between managing you going to a trainer, paying them individually,
Mhm.
right, and your work making you do it first,
Right.
right? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
when you start adding the group aspect to it, right? If your manager is making you do something as a group in order to remain employed, there becomes a cudgel, right? And there becomes an incentive that I think has helped this takeover of classical liberalism in that started, I believe, in our government and has seeped outward into private industry more and more over the last since 2011, right? That it's a
Yeah.
stacked incentive, right? And so now we're incentivizing it even more because that industry itself has grown, right? And and
Mhm.
it's when you start stacking incentives, whether monetary or social, in the wrong direction, justifying those incentives based upon the fact that some people might need this, I think is part of what got us here in the first place. And
Mm.
and it used to be, and I'm not saying that everything was perfect because we can always that's one of the base kind of true criticisms of people that say, well, you idealize the past, look at all of the wrong things that were in the past. Yes, but there were also right things in the past, and people were more self-sufficient. People dealt with their interpersonal conflicts at a more personal level. Okay,
Maybe.
and well, DEI didn't exist before 2011. You had diversity trainings, but even those
Mhm.
didn't really exist. And
Yeah.
conflict and the whole conflict management, if you want to take it out of diversity, right, and take it out of the identity portion of things, because that's where that lives, right?
Mhm.
Conflict management was not necessarily something that was a cottage industry until the last 20 or 30 years, right? And my fear is that we're stacking incentives towards the actual group mindset by
Mhm.
hiring people that are designed to profit off of that. So then you have with when you get a market, you're going to have people that fill the market, right?
Right.
And that will, as we've seen in the past with other situations, um, that nothing is coming to mind, but I know they're there. That you can incentivize the wrong thing through the market in that way,
Sure.
and all of this is really done by companies, at least, in an effort to limit liability.
Yeah, like I said,
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
huge thing for them, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a there there. And one can
But should
easily say, um, that the past that you've described,
uh-huh.
where people resolve their conflicts and stuff, maybe the conflicts were ones where this particular type of conflict was swept under the rug or just wasn't there because certain people from certain groups weren't hired in the first place, right? If we're
Mhm,
talking about 50 years ago, that's entirely possible, right? Like, oh
mhm.
no, we all get along, everything's great because you're all the same, you all come from the same place, and there
Well,
is
but
no,
but I'm not
you
gonna
know,
say that by the time we hit the 90s, we had an integrated society. I'm not saying it every way and perfect, but
yeah, of course.
but we had an integrated society. We had people working together across groups.
Hmm.
There were always going to be biases,
For sure.
And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
my
Yeah. Yeah.
point, is that now we're seem to be, whether for good, even with
Right.
the most good intentions, it seems to be we're weaponizing and monetizing the existence
Yeah.
of bias, which
So
in and of
I'll
itself will create more bias,
right. Yeah.
whether the
So
intention is good or not.
we fully agree there, right? So
Hmm.
I'll put it a better way. I'll say, maybe these things happened in the past just as much, but they were resolved in a different way because the paradigm was different, the approach was different, right? So two people could be like, "Hey, man, that was racist," or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way," and they hash it out. It's a little awkward or whatever, right?
Hmm.
And now we have a kind of circumstance where the smallest infraction gets exploded into this catastrophic event that needs thousands of dollars worth of whatever, right?
Right.
So I'm fully with you there, but
Hmm.
all we're talking about now is the poor implementation or application of the idea, not
Yeah.
necessarily the merit of the idea itself,
Right.
right? And so yeah, conflict resolution, there are a million different ways you can approach it. There are a million different ways it happens. And there's always going to be conflict between people, and then there are going
Hmm.
to be good and bad ways of approaching that. And so now we're getting to the crux of what I wrote about and what my perspective is,
Hmm.
which is that all of that is true. And what we currently have are terrible approaches to dealing with conflicts. Sometimes the conflict has nothing to do with race, as
Hmm.
in the examples that I brought up in the piece, and it's made to be about race, right? Sometimes the
Yeah.
solution is something different,
Right.
but sometimes the problem is about race,
Right.
and sometimes that requires a particular way of going about it. And
Yeah.
there can be something that offers people a way to resolve this stuff in the same way that couples therapy exists, in the same way that personal training exists, to help people do better and kind of anticipate these things, have ways of resolving them in a way that doesn't foment discord, doesn't create division, that
Hmm.
instead is about focusing on, you know, the unique individuality of each person and the common humanity that unites each person,
Hmm.
finding a way based on that fundamental principle to resolve these things, because the
Well,
reality is what it is,
right. Well, but
you
here's
know?
my yes, and I agree with the sentiment of that. But the problem is the institution for which it's done. Right. It used to be that
Mhm.
regardless of your faith, Christian, Muslim, Islam, or Buddhism or whatever, you would get that in a faith center, right? You would get
Mhm.
that the golden rule. I'm a Christian, so I'm saying, I treat others the way you want to be treated. And if you slight somebody,
Mhm.
ask forgiveness and move forward, right? And then you have the concept of charity, of trying to understand, which goes across cultures and across religions, of saying, hey, take people at their best possible intention and not their worst, right? You would get that in
Mhm.
institutions that were independent of the people that employed you. You would get those that were often independent, in at least if you want to talk
Yeah,
about
right.
schooling, right? Yeah, that were independent of schools, right? That's the whole
Mhm.
concept of separation of church and state. You would get that from a community that did not have a
Mhm.
cudgel over you like your paycheck, right?
Right.
And here's the problem I have with DEI, because I think, as is even an apparatus, because there's DEI and the concept that you want it to be, and I understand that,
Mhm.
but I do not believe that is at all DEI in reality. In
No,
DEI,
it isn't.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
and
it isn't in the vast majority of cases. No,
right,
it's
right,
not.
yes, yes, and I think we agree there.
Yeah.
But DEI in reality is a mechanism to exclude people based upon ideology, not even identity. Diversity is the shield that shields that. That's the
Yeah.
word that shields them, right? And then inclusion is the mechanism. That's where they
Mhm.
decide who's in and who's out. Because the legal term critical race, and this is what I would draw a line earlier, and it'll be very succinct. Critical race theory comes from critical legal studies. Critical legal studies helped inform the decision in the Supreme Court of the word inclusion. And the word inclusion, according to the Supreme Court in the law, means implies that to include something means to exclude something else. So
Mhm.
that's where the word inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion was used and then implanted into government and then put outward. And that's what most people don't realize about this as a mechanism, as a unit, right?
Mhm.
And equity being the goal. They didn't add that till later in the parlance. But it seems now that we're seeding more and more of what should be our culture outside of our job, or our culture outside of our government, right? To our job and to our government. And here's the problem also, and I'll let
Mm,
you um,
mhm,
expound, is that because this unit, this ideology, and this mechanism of acting is now in both embedded in our governments and in our private institutions, it's a membrane that connects the two ideologically in a way that almost makes the idea of separation of church and state moot, because this is becoming the new parlance ideology. This is becoming the new faith that is unifying the two groups. And you see
mhm,
that with monetary incentives like ESG and all of those kinds of things, but they're moving in that same direction under the same moral structure. And then they're imposing it almost like church in your trainings, right? If you're going into a training and you have to go to church, right? And these are the rules you must live by. These are the sins that you can be um, punished for, microaggressions, and they seem to get smaller and smaller and smaller, as you had said, right? It reinforcing that, even by trying to say, okay, let's take that unification, that membrane, because across institutions, public and private, and reimplant it with someone else with another better idea, still reinforces that dangerous connection between our institutions. And I think that's a
mm.
better way of saying my problem.
I don't think that it actually does that. I think, you know, so, getting back to what you mentioned about, this used to be outside of your job. This used to be something that you dealt with or you got outside of that. And there was that separation. But the reason we talked about, the reason why it exists in your job in the first place is that there are practical reasons for it. There's You are working with other people, there are interpersonal conflicts, they create complaints, they create liabilities for your organization. Your organization has to figure out some way to address that problem. And therein is the need that gets fulfilled by consultants. And then the consultants come in with their particular worldview. It could just as easily be a Christian worldview, for example, like, oh, we're not a religious organization, but we are using the Christian principles as a baseline from which to create these interpersonal guidance, whatever, right? Like, you can
Mhm.
make something like that up, and that could be a secular enough consultancy firm that could get hired by a secular organization in a secular way. And then the principles just kind of get in that way, right? But
Yeah.
you can have you can get different consultants. You
Yeah,
can
but
get
my
different,
yes, and I
so
understand.
you can get theory of enchantment, you can get theory of racelessness, you can
Right.
get fair diversity,
I
and
get
you will
that.
be fulfilling the need that exists as a
But you're also
practical need
reinforcing, I
with
think, a premise that is not, because again, this is all incentivized through grievance. And if you want to talk about critical theory is based in grievance. And so we're systemically accepting the premise that in order to alleviate grievance, we must train people how to not be grieved. You know what I mean? And that's impossible.
well,
And so
okay. I don't know if I agree with that framing though, because the thing is, this is very, like, I just think I try to think very practically, right? We're in an office, there's 200 people. Some people don't get along. Some people argue all the time. We're in HR all the time about each other. This is a problem, right? The organization is not about this. It's trying to get something done. We need to figure out how to resolve this,
well,
right? And it's
there's
not, it
other
hasn't,
ways to resolve it. You can fire
sure.
someone.
Yeah, but it hasn't necessarily escalated to the point where, anyone has done anything that's grounds for firing, but it's making working together difficult, right? And
Well, yes, but I would
the
say in years past, or let's just take the military for example. It's if there's lack of cohesion in a unit, and that
mhm,
lack of cohesion is caused by someone, you don't need necessarily an action to get fired. You just need lack of cohesion, and sometimes in a managerial standpoint, that is
sure.
enough reason to fire someone. And so I think it's, and I see I'm at least seeing where our divide is a little better.
Mhm.
Um, I hope you are too, and I appreciate this conversation. I just want to say that because it's making me think about things uh,
Sure.
that I
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
think about. Yeah, but I, I I guess I'm a bit pie in the sky. I'm a bit idealistic to think that why are we accepting the premise that we need people to manage us out of our conflicts? and to
Well,
such a level that we need to pay them to do it. And I
I
think
just
part of
think
that is
that's
incentivized by the law, right? Because you can
yeah.
be
Well,
sued
the
for anything,
yeah,
right?
things can get complicated, right? But again, it's liability. It's all these different reasons, right?
Hmm.
But the point is that sometimes people do need outside help to figure out why they're not being as productive as they can be,
Yeah.
or why they're making the same mistakes over and over again. And the mistakes aren't may not have anything to do with their job. The mistakes just might be interpersonal slights, right? That
But
are
within the job.
within the yeah happening in the workplace, right? But that matters. And so
Hmm.
it makes sense to try to find some way to address this stuff. And then of course there's here's an example, right? I remember Jon Stewart telling this story about the Daily Show and looking around at the writers' room and going, I hate this language, but he's looking around the writers' room and he's going, we all we have is a bunch of white guys. What's going on here?
Hmm.
Let's try to see if we're doing something wrong, and let's try to fix it. Right. So what did they do? They decided we're going to remove people's names from their applications for to be a writer on the show.
Hmm.
Right. And we're basically creating the blind audition
Okay.
sort of scenario, right? Where the
Sure.
musician is auditioning
Hmm.
behind the curtain. You can't see who they are. You
Hmm.
just hear the music. So they're
Yeah.
doing something similar, right? And they think, okay, great. This will be good because then, it's purely based on merit and we'll see what happens, right?
Hmm.
6 months later, or however long it's been, they're
Hmm.
looking around, still same kind of people, right? They're not getting the quote unquote diversity that they were looking for or
Hmm.
that they expected.
Hmm.
And they're like, well, what are we doing wrong? What's going on here? Right? It can't the answer can't be that there are no talented, funny people of X identity group, right?
Right.
That seems far-fetched. So what's
Yeah.
actually happening? And what they discovered, one thing that they discovered is, yeah, they took the names off of the applications, but they were still fishing in the same pools. They were fishing in Harvard and, Princeton or wherever, where there are other reasons why the populations of those places are as such as they are, right? And
Hmm.
so you're minimizing the applicant pool in a different way, right?
Hmm.
So I don't remember how they ended up fixing that problem. I think what they ended up doing is just actively seeking, removing the curtain and just actively seeking people based on their identity. I'm not sure, but what they should have done is open up the applications to literally everyone and just
Hmm.
put a thing on their website saying, submit your application. Here are the criteria.
Hmm.
And I don't care where you live. I don't care where you went to school. I don't care what your name is. Just give us your application. And if you make us laugh, we'll call you for an interview.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
the point is that there are ways to do these things that don't cede any kind of ideological ground and also conserve the principles that we're trying to strive for here.
Hmm.
You
Well,
know?
and like I said, I think that it's a noble, and you have the right, obviously the right intention, and I'm not saying I don't even fully agree. I think that you've got,
Mm-hmm.
you know, everything abhors a vacuum, right? But it's so, and that's like when I was talking to Jason on the show. You know, I I don't necessarily agree with the I guess dealing with the mechanism that we have now by using something of the same kind of structure, but I see what you're
Well,
saying.
but
Yeah, and
it's not really like fair
well, no,
diversity,
you
for example. Fair diversity, for example, doesn't do any of that kind of struggle session stuff, right? I mean, how could it?
does it
It's
inform hiring?
does it what?
Inform hiring.
Not as far as I know. No,
Okay,
it's
because I
more
think that
about existing cohorts and trying
so
to
it's more
create.
conflict resolution than it is the way that DEI functions now. Because if you look at every
Right.
DEI structure, it's built around the hiring practices because diversity is the first word, and it is to do what you were just talking about with John Stewart, right? It is
Mm-hmm.
to go out and seek people. I believe personally, and I think there's evidence for this, that it's they go out and seek people who are historically marginalized, but really they're looking for a train of thought,
Yeah,
right?
of
And then,
course.
right. So
Yeah, they're not going to hire a Glenn Lowry. They're
right,
going to hire.
exactly. They're
Yeah,
not
sure,
gonna do that. But
sure.
and this is my issue too, is that and maybe this is where I I'm finding a better dividing line is that my issues with it are in the hiring practices and the structure of DEI within that bureaucracy, because
Mm-hmm.
that's the most dangerous, pernicious part of it. The trainings to me are a little more of the aside, right? And so it's hard for me. I guess I would say this: it would be harder for me or for a legal person or an advocate to go after the DEI structure that I believe this is the most pernicious, which is
Mm-hmm.
the discrimination in hiring, blatantly, identity and ideological discrimination in hiring. If you're calling what you do the same thing, you know what I mean? Because I don't want to go after you. You know what I mean? I don't want to go after fair diversity. I
Right.
want to go after the DEI structure at the University of Oklahoma that's requiring everybody to write a DEI statement, and you don't get the DEI, you don't even get an interview if
Mm-hmm.
you have the wrong thing, the DEI statement. You know what I
Right.
mean? And
So
so,
in that case, I would advise being more specific. You don't want to go after DEI programs necessarily. You
no, I
want to go
do.
after no, but you shouldn't. What you should be going after are specific principles and practices that are illiberal and antithetical to the values
But that is
that you
not
hold.
functional in a bureaucratic structure. That's the because I've been doing this.
Well,
I've met with the governor of
I
Oklahoma
disagree.
and all that. Well, let me give you my lived experience, so to speak, and just say that because even when I was working with Fair, I had talked to Fair about bringing in Daryl Davis and things like that because I was actively trying to work on that structure at the University of Oklahoma, and I had the ears of the right people, right?
Hmm.
And what I found was, first of all, that was that when I said, okay, well, fair is fair diversity, they're doing all that kind of things. It was just like, well, what's the difference? Right? We've already got
Oh
this. Why,
well,
why do we need that? And also,
that's just a sales pitch at that point.
well, maybe,
That's a
but
matter of a sales pitch.
that's just the tip of the spear. And I don't have too much more time. I've got a doctor's appointment with my wife, but
Sure,
I would love to have you back on to continue this part of the conversation because I think this is
sure.
where it comes to the crux. But that I found that there were problems in that DEI is unit and has control over all of those apparatuses, training into hiring. It's all the way that institutions look at it now is that it's all one thing. And we
Hmm.
can't approach it the way we want it to be. We have to approach it the way it is in reality.
Well, I
And
think we should do both. I think we should understand the way it is, but never let go of the way it should be. That's the idealism. And
yeah, but
that's
you
the
can't
part
be
that matters.
idealistic about something they created. That's my point.
Well,
Is that
that's what I'm saying is,
DEI?
they may have created this particular framework and all that crap, but they didn't create diversity and they don't get to own it. And
Oh,
I
but they
refuse to give it to them.
right, but
Refuse.
no, diversity, agreed, but diversity, equity, and inclusion, disagree. They created that
Sure.
apparatus, and that's all
Yeah,
I'm saying. Yeah,
but I mean, the apparatus hinges upon the colloquial understanding of those terms. That's why people buy into it in the first place. Most people are not buying into it going, yes, I would love to fill my workplace with grievance and I would love to be tense and upset and self-flagellating constantly. I would love that. Where do I sign up? No, they're
yeah,
saying, yes, diversity is a good thing. Equity is a good thing. Inclusion is a good thing. I want to do this. Here's a
yeah,
program that is ostensibly created to facilitate that stuff. And the
mhm,
problem is that that's not true,
yeah,
but it can be true. And what you can do is offer something that actually fulfills their need. And the thing is, that's the crux of it for me. The crux of it for me is that most people want the better thing. And all you have to do is show them why it's the better thing. So Fair Diversity has a number of clients already.
yeah,
One of them is a major, major company with
mhm,
thousands and thousands of employees, and the results are phenomenal.
okay.
I can
Well,
tell you that.
I
So,
have no doubt about that. And what I'm saying is that fair diversity has not existed for very long. And
no,
it took from
it's been
2011
a year and
until
a half.
present day. Yeah, I know. Again, I'm a fan of fair. Okay,
Mhm.
it's not that. My concern is that this is called the long march through the institutions, not the short one. And so
Okay.
and I would just hope that everyone involved, and myself, because I'm going to keep an eye on it, and I know you all will too. But you all only exist
Mhm.
on the planet for a certain amount of time, and one thing that I've always said is that one thing that 1776 got right, the founders, if you want to go back to that kind of parlance, right, pejorative as it may be by other people, is that they were never thinking about themselves. They were thinking about us, right? That was when you talk about Jefferson, he talked about his posterity,
Mhm.
and it was
In
they were
half his
more.
moods.
Yes,
Sure.
well, but they were more long-term thinkers, right? And what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say is that I wanna approach this from a long-term solution, not a
Oh, me
short-term
too.
fix. Yeah, and I
Oh,
know
me
you do.
too.
I know you
Me
do.
too, for
Well,
sure.
I gotta let you go.
All
First of
right.
all, tell everybody where they can find you, and on Twitter, on Fair, all of that stuff. Let them know.
Yeah, so fairforall.org. You could find everything we're doing there. Angeleduardo.com. That's my personal website. You can see everything I've got going on personally. At Strangel Edweird on Twitter. And yeah, I'm
Yeah,
happy to chat. I'm happy
yeah.
to engage. That's what this is all about.
Yes, and I really appreciate you coming. I appreciate your perspective. You taught me some things. I hope that I
Likewise. Likewise.
clarified myself, and I
Yeah,
would love to have you back sometime, maybe on a panel or something for sure, because I think we could have some good discussions. So
sure.
thank you, Angel. I appreciate it, and we'll see you later.
Take care.